Welcome to the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program's winter webinar, Invasive Forest Pests on the Horizon. I'm Kate Four, and I work with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, a partnership between UVM Extension and the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. I will be moderating the webinar this evening. Our presenter tonight is Barbara Burns. Barbara is Forest Health Program Manager for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. She has over 30 years of experience in forest health with the department. In addition, she was instrumental in developing the Vermont Forest Pests First Detector Program and continues to serve as an advisor to the program. Welcome, Barbara, and I will now turn the microphone over to you for tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Kate. And I think the first thing I want to do is a voice check. Can you hear me? I understand that you can hear me, so I will go ahead, and I want to say thank you to all of you for showing up this evening. I think we're all glad we don't have to go out for a drive on a snowy evening. So actually, I'm kind of looking forward to trying out this webinar format, and I hope it works for you all as well. I'll try to talk a little bit and then see what we have for questions and go from there. So we're going to start. We're talking about invasive pests on the horizon, and I know many of you are forest pest first detectors and know the quote-unquote big three pretty cold. But we're going to talk about just a few pests that are not necessarily, don't necessarily have the same degree of visibility as what we call the big three. So we're going to talk about what other non-native pests are headed our way. And like I said, we're going to specifically not talk about Hemlock woolly adelgid, emerald ash borer, or the Asian longhorned beetle. I'd like to just take a minute not only to thank you folks, but also some of the other people that are instrumental in making this work. The funding's provided by Vermont and the Forest Service and USDA. I get a lot of help from the Agency of Agriculture and, of course, the University of Vermont, who's hosting this program. And many other scientists and specialists have provided the slides for this show. It was hard to choose. Kate said I couldn't talk about every single non-native pest that we have. And there are quite a few that have been coming into the state or nearby and that are of concern to us. So it was pretty hard to pick and choose which kind of pest we want to be looking at. So of this long list and many more that aren't on the list, I thought I'd choose some that are close by and are threatening our trees right that you might actually find if you go out. And then a couple of others that, well, they're already here, but I want you to look for them anyway, and I'll tell you why as the session goes on. The first one may be familiar to those of you that are more active on the Hemlock woolly adelgid side of things. And I'd like to start by talking about a different pest on hemlock called the Elongate hemlock scale. There's a lot of scale insects out there. They're a pretty diverse looking group of insects. Often they have really a hard scale on the outside, but just as often they have a wool on the outside, just like some of the woolly adelgids. But they are sucking insects, as you can see on the pictures to the lower right there. These are all sucking insects that suck the juices out of plants. Elongate hemlock scale does indeed eat hemlock, and you'll see that's the primary host listed, but it's also a host of fir, spruce, and can even eat Douglas fir and some of the other conifers. So unlike Hemlock woolly adelgid, which is exclusive to hemlock, Elongate hemlock scale does have other hosts. But it's another one from East Asia. This one came to the United States from Japan, but it's been here a long time. It came into Queens, New York about 100 years ago. People that have had hemlock woolly adelgid for a while say that they often find elongate hemlock scale on trees that are infested with hemlock woolly adelgid. It's known to occur in 15 states now, including some states that are pretty nearby. New Hampshire recently, and Maine even more recently, have found elongate hemlock scale, as well as the state of New York. It's also in southern Massachusetts, and here you can see, in this slide, you can see the places where elongate hemlock scale has been found in New Hampshire and Maine, and you can see it's pretty well by the seacoast or not too far inland in the southern parts of the states. Like hemlock woolly adelgid, elongate hemlock scale is important to us because hemlock is one of the more common tree species in the state, and it's pretty well distributed statewide. And something that's of particular concern, and the other states report this to us, is that elongate hemlock scale seems to really like the trees that are already stressed by hemlock woolly adelgid. That previous stress makes it more inviting to the scale, and some states say it's actually the scale that kills the trees. And as you can see in this map on the left, that's where hemlock woolly adelgid already is in the state of Vermont, and probably some of the areas where we might expect elongate hemlock scale to spread to. Well, how do you know if you have elongate hemlock scale? Well, one thing you can look for is actually the scales themselves occur underneath the hemlock needles, but you can still see the symptoms on the upper surfaces. Here's a photo of the needles showing the yellow spots on the foliage, and you can sometimes see that even from a distance, and almost like a dirty appearance on the trees. There's another slide showing the yellow spots from a distance. The dirty appearance is probably from what's underneath as much as anything. The scale, male and females, look actually different from each other. The females are the dark ones, and the males are the lighter colored. They have a kind of a waxy coating. The slide also shows a newly settled immature nymph. And they do produce quite a bit of wax, and sometimes the wax can really give the elongate hemlock scale infested needles a fuzzy look to them, which you can see pretty well in these slides. Apparently people have been finding elongate hemlock scale more often than not later in the season, say August time. So it's a particularly good time to be looking out for this insect. Apparently it's just more obvious at that stage of its life. Just so that you know what some of the other life stages look like, you won't probably be looking for these because they're very tiny. But the mobile stage, the crawlers, as you can see, are very small. You can see the little, those of you that have spent some time looking at the hemlock needles know those little white dots on the bottom of a hemlock needle are pretty small. So that gives you an idea of the scale there. And this is also showing the egg stage. The crawlers are the stage that the scale moves from tree to tree with this crawler stage. There are other kinds of scale insects on needles, on hemlock needles. This is a graphic that was put together by the U.S. Forest Service. And if you look at them closely, you can see that they look quite a bit different. That's the elongate hemlock scale in the upper left corner. And some of the other scales have more pointed shapes, more round shapes, more oyster shell shapes. So there are a variety, so look at them closely before you decide, oh, that's it. And of course, there's a lot of information online. I will provide Kate with some of the links online after the program, but there's a lot of information online that you can use to get more information. So I wanted to stop here and see if there are any questions right off on the elongate hemlock scale.
And just a reminder to folks, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box.
Well, hearing none right now, we'll move along to something else. And it's going to be the brown spruce longhorn beetle. If any of you folks come from the Northeast Kingdom, I'm seeing some questions. And I am going to stop to answer them. There's just a couple of them. Well, what can we do about the scale? It is one of those insects that we don't know occurs in Vermont. So I think right at the moment, the first thing we're doing is we're just looking for elongate hemlock scale. As it turns out, some of the management techniques that work for hemlock woolly adelgid also work for the hemlock scale. So on an individual tree basis, there are controls to it. And the other question was, is it less likely in northern Vermont? I guess the answer to that is we think so. Judging by the fact in 100 years it hasn't moved very quickly north suggests that it is cold sensitive, but there's not as much information about that as there is about the hemlock woolly adelgid. So I'm going to move now to the brown spruce longhorn beetle, and like I say, this will make it so the folks in the northeastern part of the state don't feel left out of the discussion here, because this is an insect that's coming towards us from a different direction. Thanks to Asian longhorn beetle, you're all familiar with some of the basics about the group of beetles called longhorn beetles. Yes, they do have long antennae. The grub stage, which is in the lower right-hand corner, they're pretty uniform from one longhorn beetle species to another. They're very hard to tell apart. So when you've seen one, you've seen them all with the longhorn beetle grubs. You're also familiar with the very coarse sawdust that Asian longhorn beetle produces. Well, the brown spruce longhorn beetle produces a very similar kind of coarse sawdust. This insect was first detected about 10 years ago in Nova Scotia in the port of Halifax. I'm finding it interesting that actually there's been quite a few introductions through the port of Halifax. Beech bark disease was first noted in that part of the continent. The beech mining weevil, which has been recently detected in North America, has been detected in that area. So it's a busy port, and it has its share of new introductions that come in through Halifax. Just 2 years ago, this brown spruce longhorn beetle was found for the first time in the province of New Brunswick. Where the little red A is on this map shows you where it was found in the province. Again, another pest that can be carried on firewood. It's not just our hardwood pests that can be carried that way, also the softwoods as well. As you can imagine, the state of Maine is quite concerned about the movement of brown spruce longhorn beetle. It's moving their way. In Canada, the insect has attacked a variety of spruces. Basically, if it's a spruce that grows in eastern Canada, brown spruce longhorn beetle seems to like it. It has caused quite a bit of mortality. It does like the bigger, older, mature trees more than the young, vigorous trees, but it has caused quite a bit of mortality in the province of Nova Scotia. Red spruce is a pretty common, important species in Vermont. As you know, it occurs in the mountains, it occurs in the northeast. And it's the 6th most common species in Vermont, so this is another insect that we're really concerned about. There is a trap that we can use to try to detect the brown spruce longhorn beetle, and for the last bunch of years we've been conducting trap surveys for brown spruce longhorn beetle, concentrated mostly in the northeastern part of the state, although this last year USDA APHIS really branched out and put traps in quite a few other places as well. And this is where we had traps deployed in 2012. Well, you may be aware that conifer trees, when they're healthy and they're attacked, they produce pitch. That's what pitch really is a sign of. If conifers can fight back, they will, and the way they fight is with pitch. So a healthy tree that's attacked by brown spruce longhorn beetle will produce a lot of pitch, and often in Canada they say that's one of the first signs of beetle infestation. So how do you know about a brown spruce longhorn beetle? How can you tell it's there? Guess what? The round exit holes. There you see one, 4 to 6 millimeters in diameter, about the size there you have compared to a Canadian dime, which I believe are pretty similar to those in the United States. Apparently the adults are quite difficult to find. They're nice camouflaged color, as you can see from this slide. So you probably wouldn't expect to see those as a way of detecting. That's why we have the traps. And besides which, there's quite a bit of few native species in the genus of brown spruce longhorn beetle, the genus Tetropium. You may see the galleries if you peel off the bark. They do engrave the surface of the bark between the bark and the wood when they're first feeding, and it's just later on in their life cycle that they tunnel into the wood. And they make a very characteristic L-shaped gallery, as you can see in the photo on the right. Again, that coarse sawdust that you're familiar with Asian longhorn beetle, they produce that as well. And again, there's more information available online. This time we're looking to Canada to fill in the gaps. I do see a question here, and it says, what's the rough timeline from infestation to mortality? I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that the insect, in its native range, it goes after the unhealthy trees, and those would be the trees that would die faster, but I'm afraid I don't know the mortality rate. Are there any other questions about brown spruce longhorn beetle? It's an interesting subject for me to discuss, is all the insects we don't have, because these are the ones that, just like yourselves, I don't have much first-hand experience with. So sometimes we have to learn together on these. And I'm going to go to another one then, and that's oak wilt. I myself am a pathologist by training. I studied forest diseases when I was in school, and I spend most of my time working with insects, but here's a fungus disease that's paid a visit nearby here to Vermont, and I think we should be really concerned about and looking for the disease oak wilt. And as I mentioned, it is a fungus disease, in most of its life it spends in the microscopic stage. And it inhabits wood. It causes the trees to wilt by growing through the wood, particularly through the vessels in the wood, the straws that carry the water up through the tree. It clogs them. And here you can see a picture of a fungus clogging the vessels of the wood by growing through them. It does produce a little bit of a presence externally on the surface of the wood. The gray that you see here in the center of the slide, that's a fungus mat, which smells good and is quite attractive to some insects that may wander by. So one way that oak wilt spreads is by some of the insects, sap beetles that happen to be wandering by, and they'll visit the mat and may visit a fresh wound on a healthy tree. It's not a particularly efficient way for the disease to move back and forth, because those beetles aren't any more attracted to oaks than any other kind of tree. So it's not terribly efficient, but it does move the disease now short distances. The other way it moves is through root grafts. A lot of tree species are able to connect, actually have functional connections underground between their roots. And oaks are one of those groups of trees. And the fungus can actually move underground through these grafted roots. Where did it come from? Well, we don't exactly know. They do know that oak wilt was first reported in the mid-1800s. Wasn't really identified until 100 years later. But something about the pattern of spread reminds people of an exotic disease. And so more and more people are referring to oak wilt as a non-native disease that came from, we don't know where, but somewhere else. This is showing the symptoms of oak wilt. But it is, and as you can see, it looks a lot like its very close relative Dutch elm disease. And in fact, they're in the same genus of fungus. But there's a real big difference between oak wilt and Dutch elm disease. The reason that Dutch elm disease has made headlines and oak wilt hasn't is that Dutch elm disease has a very good insect to spread it from one tree to another. The elm bark beetles are elm specialists, and they're very, very good at moving the fungus from tree to tree. So the only thing really that separates oak wilt from Dutch elm disease in terms of its severity to the tree is the absence of a good insect to carry it from tree to tree. It relies instead, like I say, on this not very specific sap beetle. So where is it now? As I mentioned, it's mostly concentrated in the Midwest. It's actually also an important disease of the live oaks down in Texas. You see it's just crept into Pennsylvania, but that's as close as it's been for a long time. Back when I started in the career, this is about what the map looked like. But in 2008, there was a new detection, and that was just outside of Schenectady in Glenville, New York. And they believe that the disease was brought there, yes, on firewood. And it had been there a few years. The trees were, there was quite a group of dead trees. And there was a real concern at the time because the development where the infested trees were found really backed on a piece of wildland, and would have been quite difficult to control if it had spread into that oak woodland. But they did conduct an eradication project. There were quite a few homeowners involved. And but they either cut down or in some cases treated every oak. They separated the root systems from one tree to the next by digging trenches, and this appears to have been successful. They haven't seen oak wilt come back in that neighborhood. So the distribution map of oak wilt, as far as we know it, is as it was before. So what's at stake here in Vermont? Well, I guess obviously red oak is an important tree species, not only in terms of its number, but it's also important to many wildlife species here. Again, more common in the southern warmer parts of the state. In addition, it's an important sawlog species, and there's a particular concern here with oak wilt in terms of exports, because should our state ever have an oak wilt infection or a known infestation of oak wilt, we would come under oak wilt quarantines. Other countries don't want it. In fact, in Europe, they have a beetle that would be just right for spreading oak wilt from tree to tree. So they particularly don't want this fungus disease. So we don't want this disease in our state. It is a tree killer. And that it doesn't spread quickly, but if at some point one of those exotic beetles for oak came over here, we could have the same exact problem. So it's certainly one we're looking for and watching out for. So what are we looking for? This is a disease that's spread in the springtime. And the symptoms can show up quite quickly. You can see a bronzing or yellowing sometime in the spring. A really characteristic symptom is the sort of half browning of oak leaves, and there tends to be a very clear defined margin between the brown part and the green part of symptomatic leaves. In many trees, the symptoms will spread quite quickly through the crown, so it'll have just a few symptoms early in the summer, and later on the tree will be dying or dead. Showing another photo of a tree that's starting to lose its leaves. In fact, both green and brown leaves can be shed. You can see the leaves on the ground underneath this tree. So dropping leaves all at once is a symptom to really pay attention to on an oak tree. As I mentioned, it's a wilt disease. It grows in the wood, and you will see a staining in the wood just like you do for a tree that's infected with, say, Dutch elm disease or another wilt disease. That's showing the staining pattern again. As I mentioned, there's this fungal mat that will grow on the surface of the wood. When the bark starts to slough off, that attracts the sap beetles and other insects that might carry it. People familiar with the fungus say that it has a very distinctive smell that you know when you're in an oak wilt infected area because of that fermented fruity odor of this fungal mat. But maybe one of the key things to look for or to keep in mind about oak wilt is that it definitely is a slow mover, and it spreads out from a center. So because it moves through the root grafts, you will see some trees in the center of the infected area that are perfectly dead, and as that you go out from the center, the trees will be in won't have been dead as long until you get to the edge of the area where you have trees that are just now dying and developing symptoms. So this, as you can see, the symptoms are not uniform across this area of oak trees. And that really differentiates it from something that we do see in Vermont now and again, which is oak mortality from defoliation and or drought. Many people called in this summer seeing the dead oak trees off of I-89 in Middlesex. That's what these photographs are from, that area. That was an area that had been defoliated several years in a row by oak leaf tying complex of caterpillars. And as you look at this, you can't see at the slide that's taken from the air, you don't really see any defined infection centers like I was pointing out before. The symptoms are scattered throughout the stand. All the trees sort of died at the same time. So it's a different pattern of symptom development than we would get with oak wilt. Again, more information online. So let's see what we have for questions. One of the questions was, is tree pruning a danger in spreading the fungus? And should we be cautious of the time of year to prune oaks? The answer to the first question is yes, it would be possible to spread the fungus by pruning a tree. So the answer to that question is yes. Should we be cautious? I think it's always helpful to be cautious when moving from one location to another when pruning, because that is an opportunity to spread a variety of diseases. So it is recommended to sterilize pruning equipment with a rub of alcohol or with a dilute solution of bleach between one location and another. In the case of Vermont, we don't know or think we don't have oak wilt yet, so hopefully it's not a big risk here in Vermont, but it's always sanitary practices are always desirable. What is the plan of attack for the disease? Well, one thing is so far we've been pretty good at not getting oak wilt in Vermont. It is a slow mover. Like I said, the map looks very similar to how it looked 40 years ago when I first heard of oak wilt. So, so I guess we don't have an immediate plan of attack like we do for emerald ash borer that we know we're going to get. Again, it would be delineation. Eradication did work in the case of the eastern New York in infested area, so perhaps that might be an option in Vermont as well. And can utility pruning companies spread via their equipment? Again, any long distance movement of equipment, it's really good to use sanitary practices between one location and another to reduce the probability of spreading not only this pest, but a variety of pests. So what do we have next? Winter moth. Winter moth is one of the inchworm caterpillars. They're sometimes called loopers, measuring worms, geometers. So it's one of those inchworm caterpillars. Here's showing the various life stages of the winter moth. You can see the looper caterpillar. They have front legs and back legs, but no middle legs in the upper right-hand corner. In the left, you see the moths. It's called the winter moth because the males fly in, well, very late in the season. In Vermont, we call closely related moths hunter's moths because of when they fly. So the males, as you can see, the females don't do a lot of flying. They don't have any wings. The host, well, it's a polyphagous feeder, which means it has a lot of different species of trees it likes to eat. Oaks are big favorites. Maples, including red maple, particularly in the area that it occurs in. I've seen a lot of defoliation of red maple. And a variety of other species. It's been of concern to cranberry growers in eastern Massachusetts, where it also will feed on them. I would say, though, the primary host in the places in North America has been the oak species. Well, this one's been around for a while as well. It was introduced to Nova Scotia from Europe. It was first detected in around 1930 in Nova Scotia. And there was a separate introduction in British Columbia and Vancouver area in the 1950s. I want to give a little side story before I move on about where it is and tell what happened in Nova Scotia. Like I say, it was introduced around by 1930, caused a lot of defoliation. It had no native natural enemies with it, and caused a lot of defoliation. And then in the mid-50s, a parasitic fly that is specific to winter moth was introduced into Nova Scotia. And as you can see in the graph, the solid line shows the amount of defoliation caused by winter moth. It was going up and down, but pretty consistent. And then about 10 years after that parasite was first released, all of a sudden the defoliation plummeted, and winter moth really has not been a significant forest health problem in Nova Scotia since that time. Fast forward to the 1990s, where winter moth was detected in eastern Massachusetts. And this is about where it's located right now. Just very recently, it was detected in the very southern part of Maine near the coast. It spread to a few counties in New Hampshire. In Massachusetts, it's about as far west as Fitchburg, Mass. And I think actually it may have inched as far west in New York as Staten Island. But it hasn't spread into the cooler climate zones, and I think it may be a little bit cold limited. It can initiate a decline in eastern Massachusetts. When it first occurred, there was year after year, successive year of defoliation. And as many of you know, trees can tolerate, most healthy trees can tolerate a year or two of defoliation, but if it's 4 or 5 years in a row, that's a different story. So there has been some mortality in eastern Massachusetts from the winter moth. And there's a picture. But there's some other reasons that we're concerned in Vermont. Maybe the cold temperatures we have would be enough to kill a winter moth, but it turns out it's able to interbreed with a very close relative. It's a native insect, the Bruce Spanworm. Bruce Spanworm likes our sugar maples. It occurs in Vermont, common. And we're concerned about this potential that winter moth has to interbreed with Bruce Spanworm. It's a big unknown. We don't know if the hybrid will be more cold tolerant. We don't know. Bruce Spanworm is a sugar maple defoliator, and we don't know if the interbreeding will shift the host preferences a little bit of the winter moth. This map was produced by some researchers at University of Massachusetts, and the red shows winter moth, and the green shows where Bruce Spanworm has been trapped. It's been a big trapping program. It's very hard to tell the two apart. They have to do DNA studies usually to tell the difference. But they have found that there are indeed some of the specimens that they trap have characteristics of both Bruce Spanworm and winter moth. So there is a lot of research being done on this insect. They are looking again at that parasitic fly, and there have been some releases done in eastern Massachusetts. But the researchers, Joe Elkington, the entomology professor from University of Massachusetts, calls me every year and says, I'd really like to find some outbreaking populations of Bruce Spanworm. Do you know of any? And the last few years, I haven't known of any, and that's what I'm really asking for your help with. Maybe not so much looking for the winter moth, but helping us find populations of Bruce Spanworm, which would help these researchers continue their work. You won't find the egg stage. That's an egg curled up in a little bit of moss. It's a little hard to see. And you won't be able to tell the differences between the caterpillars. That happens to be Bruce Spanworm on the left and winter moth on the right. But you'll see them in early spring. Like I say, we're mostly looking for the Bruce Spanworm at this point because that's the one we think we have or know we have, the native insect. And that's really active really just as soon as the leaves are fully expanded in the month of May. And it causes a lacy kind of defoliation. Both species do. Some of the larger caterpillars, the gypsy moths and forest tent caterpillars of the world, they take big bites. Well, Bruce Spanworm gives the leaves a more lacy kind of defoliation, which you can look up into the trees, and here again you see the lacy look of the defoliated trees. So I'm wondering if anyone has any questions about winter moth or its native cousin, the Bruce Spanworm. I'm not seeing any right now. So I'm going to move along. I'm going to talk about a slightly different kind of situation. This is the last major one I'm going to cover this evening, and it's the white pine blister rust. And as you know, it's been around for a while, so you may be wondering why, but we'll get into that in a minute here. White pine blister rust is another fungus disease. It infects the trees. Actually, it infects the needle first. And the fungus goes down through the needle, down through the base of the needle into the twig, down through the twig into the branch, down through the branch into the trunk. And if it makes it as far as the trunk, that's when it kills the tree. And here you can see the discoloration. To the left, you can see the part where the fungus has already killed the branch. You can see the dead needles there. On the right-hand side, you can see that the wood is still green, but if the fungus is allowed to continue growing, it will grow down that branch into the main stem. Every spring, it can produce spores on the white pine. These pustules contain spores, and the spores from those pustules will be carried by the wind to the leaves of currant or gooseberries, anything in the genus ribes, which are alternate hosts. And without these alternate hosts, the white pine blister rust cannot survive. They're necessary to complete the disease cycle. So it infects these leaves. And on the underside of the currant or gooseberry leaves, it produces another kind of spore, these orange pustules you see here. And those spores travel back to the white pine trees. So a white pine tree cannot infect another white pine tree. A white pine tree can only infect a currant or a gooseberry bush. So unlike the oak wilt, where you see clusters and clusters of trees close together, with white pine blister rust, the symptomatic trees are often scattered apart. There's a close-up of the pustules. You can see why it gets the name rust. That was rust-colored spores. You can see the swelling. That's very characteristic. And pitch production. Often infected white pine trees will produce gobs of pitch. In fact, that's often the way that I notice blister rust infected trees in the woods. If it's in the main stem, that's when the tree can be killed. And here you see a tree. You can see the top half of the tree is yellow, the bottom is green. Well, I'd pay money to say that there's a blister rust canker in between, in the main stem, right between the green and the yellow branches. So here's just a schematic of the life cycle. Again, the spores from the pine go to the ribes, spores from ribes go to pine. If you take away one or the other, you have no disease. So where did blister rust come from? Well, it's native to Asia, but it didn't get here directly from Asia. It got here by way of Europe. 100 years ago, the technology in North America for growing seedlings wasn't very good, and instead of growing our own seedlings, we shipped our seeds to Europe. And in countries in Europe, they produced seedlings and shipped the seedlings back here. In fact, rumor has it that in the hull of the Titanic, there were seedlings bound for New England forest planting. So we had our seedlings produced in Europe, and somewhere along the way, they became infected with white pine blister rust and came back to North America. And when the trees came back here, they were infected. This map just shows the spread of white pine blister rust. As you can see with the blue lines, this area was one of the first areas infected. Blister rust is also an important disease to 5-needle pines in the western United States. Why is it important? Well, it is a tree killer. Especially young trees are easily killed, so it's especially important for forest regeneration. And of course, pine is an important species in the state as well. In terms of timber tree, it has one of our largest growing stock volumes. It's the 4th largest, most important species in terms of timber in the state. So why am I asking you to look for white pine blister rust when it's already everywhere? Well, as many of you may know, there was a big program for years and years to get rid of white pine blister rust by getting rid of currants and gooseberries. Crews were hired in the 1930s in the CCC days, and then for years afterwards to go through the woods and pull up currant and gooseberry bushes, to treat them with herbicides, to do whatever it took to rid the woods of currants and gooseberries. And many states, well, at that time, all those states had quarantines where it was illegal to plant currants and gooseberries. And for a long time, no one planted them. Interestingly, in European countries, in some it's illegal to plant white pine trees for the same reason. But along the way, white pine blister rust was perceived to be less of a problem. One of the reasons was that our little trees grew into big trees and became a little bit less susceptible. But another reason was that a number of resistant varieties of currant and gooseberry bushes were developed, and these became quite popular. And now some states still have a quarantine. New Hampshire does, Maine does, Vermont does not have a quarantine prohibiting the growing of currant and gooseberry bushes. So they're becoming quite popular. Well, the bad news is that some of the cultivars that are supposedly resistant to blister rust turn out not to be completely resistant. We have had for the last few years very good conditions for growing fungus diseases, and so probably the disease expression is higher in the last few years than it had been in previous years. But this shows a survey that the state of New Hampshire did last summer, going to ribes plantations that had resistant cultivars. And as you can see, the brown and the gold circles are plantations that had symptoms of white pine blister rust on the currant leaves. So I believe it's worth raising awareness in Vermont. We're probably not at the tipping point yet where currants and gooseberries are grown everywhere, but if we get to that stage, we want to do it with our eyes open, knowing the risks that we're taking. And I'm asking you, if you have currants and gooseberries, or your friends and neighbors do, take a look yourself and look for these characteristic yellow dots on the underside of the leaves. They're in midsummer is when you would want to be looking for them, and help us to understand this disease a little bit more and how it may in fact be affecting resistant ribes. And in fact, in New Hampshire, they have put a moratorium on even the resistant ribes in the state at this point until they figure this out a little better. Any questions on white pine blister rust? I see there are some. Are there any other alternate hosts for white pine blister rust? It's anything in the genus ribes, but they're not. It's not uniform. The European black currant has historically been the most susceptible to white pine blister rust and the one that's been of most concern. A second question is, can you stop the blister rust by removing an infected branch? The answer is yes, you can. You have to get it early. If the fungus has already moved all the way to the main stem, it's too late. But if you get it when the symptoms are out towards the end of the branch, you can in fact cure the tree or keep it from spreading. The good news is that you don't have to worry about what you do with that branch that you cut off. Rust fungi are dead when their host material is dead. They can't survive on dead host material. So there's not a problem unless there's actually spores being produced on the branch in the May of the year. I think you'd want to be careful. But other than that, the branch is not a problem. Another question, what time of year will this most likely show up? The symptoms on white pine are in the spring. The pustules on the white pine. The symptoms, the fruiting structures on the underside of the currant and gooseberry leaves would be in midsummer. And any alternate conifer hosts. It's the 5-needled pines. Like I say, western white pine is susceptible as well as the eastern white pine. So any of the what they call the 5-needled pines are susceptible, but none of what we call the hard pines. So for instance, a red pine would not be susceptible to the disease. Any other questions about white pine blister rust? We'll continue to be able to take questions, or I could open it up to others. As you can see, there's quite a few insects and diseases that we didn't talk about today, but I wanted to particularly focus on these that are nearby, there's really a realistic expectation that we might actually see them in Vermont, and something we really want to look for. And as I said, in the case of winter moth, just knowing if we can find populations of Bruce Spanworm to help the researchers out. And with blister rust, taking a deep breath and a second look at planting ribes species when we're not quite sure how resistant the resistant varieties might be. I'm wrapping up here, so I'm looking to see if there's more questions.
Thanks, Barbara. I actually see a question coming in. Okay, so I can see some typing, but it looks like it's just folks saying thank you. So, so thank you very much, Barbara, for joining us this evening.
I'm not seeing more questions,
really
so maybe I'll turn the microphone back over to Kate.
Just a reminder to folks, some of the handouts that Barbara mentioned during the presentation will be available on the webinar website. And I will also send out a follow-up email to the folks who registered tomorrow, just with a link to that website and any additional handout information as well. I did want to ask folks, if you have a second, please complete the evaluation. We really are interested in your feedback. This is the first of our webinar series. So if you look in the chat box there, there's a link to the evaluation for tonight's webinar. Please take a moment to fill that out. And let's see here. There's a link. I'm sorry. Here we go. There's a link on your screen as well. Lastly, as I mentioned, this is the first in the series. So next month, on February 20th, we will have our second webinar, and that'll be on Vermont tree laws. We'll be joined by Paul Gillies, and he's going to provide us with a refresher on some of Vermont's public tree laws. So we look forward to you joining us next month for the next webinar. And then lastly, I just wanted to share, I know there are some new names out there, and so I wanted to let folks know if you're interested in some of our other educational programs, we do have a e-newsletter called Tree Mail. You can find the link to sign up for that off of our program website, which is a pretty easy URL to remember. It's www.vtcommunityforestry.org. So with that, I guess just one final last reminder is that if anybody is looking for CEUs for tonight's presentation, please, before you sign off, please include your full name, the CEUs that you're looking for, whether it's ISA, pesticides, or SAF, and certification or license number in the chat box. Again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and look forward to seeing you next month for a refresher on Vermont tree laws. Thank you everybody. Have a good evening.